They laughed when she stepped out of the transport too young, too quiet, too small for a battlefield swallowed by winter. In the dead silence of an abandoned city, even seasoned soldiers refused to move forward. Then a whisper crackled through comms. Viper 9 is online. Seconds later, a shot split the frozen air, precise, impossible, undeniable. One by one, targets dropped before anyone could even locate her. The elite battalion that mocked her now stood frozen, not by the cold but by fear. Because somewhere in the ruins, a ghost with a call sign had already decided who lived and who didn't. The snow had been falling for 11 hours without pause. It came down in the kind of silence that didn't feel natural, no wind, no friction, just weight. Each flake pressed into the ruins of Kessler Bridge, like a final sentence being written over something already dead. The city had been abandoned for 3 years, officially. Before that, it had been ordinary. 40,000 people, a river, a market district, a cathedral with 2 spires. Now the spires were broken at the neck, and the market was a maze of collapsed awnings and frozen glass, and the river had sealed over so completely you could walk it without knowing. The buildings had the look of things interrupted mid-sentence. A restaurant still had its awning partially, and the iron frame had bent under ice accumulation into a shape that resembled a question mark if you looked at it from the right angle. A shoe store had a single boot in the window, standing upright on the display platform as if waiting for a customer to come back and claim the matching one. Somewhere in the 3rd block, a child's tricycle was frozen into the sidewalk ice at an angle that suggested it had been moving when the cold took it. These details accumulated into something that was harder to name than simple danger. It was the wrongness of interruption. Cities were supposed to have endings, populations moved, buildings were demolished, history was archived. Kessler Bridge had simply stopped. The 40,000 people had not finished their sentence. They had walked out of it mid-syllable, and now the city held the shape of all those incomplete acts in its frozen quiet. Staff Sergeant Devon Marsh had been in cold before. Siberian cold, Norwegian cold. The particular empty cold of high-altitude mornings when your breath crystallized before it left your lips. But Kessler Bridge was different. It wasn't just temperature. It was the absence of everything that made temperature bearable. No movement, no sound, no proof that life had ever passed through here and intended to return. He stood at the tree line with Bravo platoon, 12 men at his back, watching the outer perimeter of the city through thermal imaging. The scope showed nothing. That was the problem. 36 hours ago, Delta Company 48 soldiers, 2 forward operating specialists, 1 embedded intelligence analyst, had entered from the eastern approach. Radio contact had held for 4 hours. Then a burst of static. Then nothing. No emergency beacon, no sit rep, no bodies recovered. 48 soldiers. Gone. What's the threat assessment on this? Corporal Brett Holloway asked from his right flank. Holloway was 26, built like a door, the kind of soldier who'd grown up thinking fear was a character flaw. He wasn't afraid now. He was something closer to confused. Unknown, Marsh said. Unknown meaning they don't know, or unknown meaning they're not telling us. Both. Holloway was quiet for a moment. I don't like unknowns. Nobody answered him. They all felt it, the particular weight of a mission where the briefing had stopped short of explaining what actually happened to the unit before them. High Command had called it environmental obstruction. 3 officers in that briefing room had used almost exactly the same phrase, which meant it had been carefully chosen, which meant it covered something that didn't have a clean name yet. Captain Russell Vance moved through the line and stopped beside Marsh. Vance was 41, cropped gray at the temples, the kind of man whose stillness was itself a language. He had fought in places nobody made documentaries about. He did not gesture when he spoke. We move at 0600, Vance said. Eastern Gate, same approach as Delta. Same approach, Marsh repeated. The implication sat between them. Command wants the same route confirmed passable or compromised. Vance's tone didn't rise or fall. If it's compromised, we establish that and pull back. And if we disappear too? Vance looked at him. Not a threatening look. Just level. Then someone else comes after us with the same question. That was the conversation. That was all of it. At 0545, a second transport arrived. Not from the main road, from the eastern tree line. A narrow path nobody had marked on the tactical map. It parked 20 meters from the staging area, and the door opened. One person got out. She carried a hard case that came up to her hip. Her kit was clean, not new soldier clean, but minimally deployed clean. She wore no rank insignia visible on her outer layer. She was young, not ambiguously young. Visibly, undeniably young, the kind of young that made experienced men recalibrate how long they'd been doing this. She stopped in front of Vance and handed him a single, folded document. He read it. His expression didn't change. He handed it back. "Gentlemen," he said, turning to the platoon, "we have a remote fire support asset joining this operation. She falls under my direct authorization. Questions go through me." "She?" Holloway said, not loud, but everyone heard it. The girl, and in that first moment, even Marsh could not have called her anything, but that did not react. She tucked the document back into her chest pocket, picked up her case, and walked to the edge of the group to study the city's skyline through a monocular. No introduction, no request for acknowledgement. She simply began working. "What's her name?" Marsh asked Vance quietly. Vance glanced at the document he no longer held. "Her call sign is Viper 9. Nobody laughed outright. But the silence that followed was the kind that precedes laughter, the kind where everyone was deciding if it was appropriate. Kessler Bridge waited ahead of them, patient and lightless, and somewhere inside it, 48 soldiers had simply stopped existing. Her name, they would learn later, was Lauren Caldwell. She was 23 years old. She had a face that read younger, no harsh lines, no weathered skin, eyes that might have been described as gentle by anyone who hadn't watched them work. She'd arrived with one rifle, one sidearm, one pack, and a thermal optics kit that Marsh didn't recognize the model of, which meant it was either very new or very specialized. During the final equipment check before entry, she sat apart from the group, assembling her rifle from the case with the mechanical ease of someone who'd done it without looking so many times the hands had memorized the order. The rifle was not standard issue. It was a long-range precision platform with a suppressor system attached, and even from 10 meters away, Marsh could tell the glass on her scope was high-end, the kind that required budget authorization he'd never been approved for. Nobody spoke to her directly. Holloway spoke about her, which was worse. "Seriously, what's the logic here?" he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "We're walking into a city that ate an entire company, and they send us what? Backup from the junior division?" Private First Class Dean Wicker laughed. PFC Wicker was 21 and had been in the field for 8 months and had the confidence of someone who hadn't yet learned what confidence cost. "She looks like she's here for a school field trip," Wicker said. "Someone else. Maybe she's the analyst. Analysts stay in the truck. She's not staying in the truck. Then I don't know what to tell you." Marsh watched her through all of it. She gave no sign of having heard. That in itself was information either she genuinely hadn't, or she'd decided it cost nothing to respond to. Both possibilities made her more interesting than the men doing the talking. He had learned, in 12 years of service, that the most dangerous people in any environment were never the ones who demanded acknowledgement. The ones who performed confidence were usually compensating. The ones who moved without needing an audience had already decided what they were. He didn't know yet what she had decided, but the way she handled her rifle, the weight of it, the absence of ceremony told him something. She treated it the way experienced surgeons treat their instruments. Not precious, not casual, functional. At 0558, Vance called final formation. Caldwell stood at the far end of the line. She'd slung the rifle across her back. Her posture was straight without being rigid. When Vance outlined the movement plan, Eastern Gate, parallel to the main boulevard, advanced to the first confirmed grid point where Delta's signal had cut. She looked at the overhead map image on the tablet he held with the particular attention of someone committing a route to memory rather than following it in. Real time. "Any questions?" Vance asked. "Yeah," Holloway said. "What exactly is she here to do?" Vance looked at him. "Overwatch." "From where?" Caldwell answered before Vance could. "I'll find a position." Her voice was quiet, even, not performing anything. She said it the way someone says, "I'll handle the coffee," matter of fact. Unthreatening. Requiring no further discussion. Holloway stared at her. She had already turned back to the city. They moved out at 0601. She split off from the main column without instruction, not dramatically, just a gentle angle, carrying herself low. Her footprints in the snow, the smallest of the group, spacing herself with the instinct of someone who understood that proximity was a liability. Within 90 seconds, she had moved perpendicular to the column and was working her way toward a partially collapsed parking structure that rose 4 stories above the main street. Marsh watched her go. Nobody else did. They were already focused on what was in front of them, and what was in front of them was silence and ruin and the ghost of 48 men who hadn't come back. They had no room, any of them, to be thinking about one quiet girl with a long rifle. That was a mistake. Not the kind that kills you in a moment, the kind that takes longer, the kind that comes from looking at what you expect to see instead of what's actually there. The city swallowed the column in its particular way, not like an ambush, not like an attack, but like absorption. One building, then the next. The snow coming off the facades in small slides. The wind working through the hollow interiors and producing sounds that weren't quite language and weren't quite not. "Comms check," Vance said. Voices confirmed in sequence. 11 soldiers, 1 captain, then a 13th voice, quieter than the rest, a little compressed by distance. Viper Nove, online. And then silence again. They had been moving for 22 minutes when PFC Wicker took a wrong step. It wasn't carelessness. The street had been clear, visually clear, with no debris that suggested an IED, no disturbed snow pattern, no indicator that the flagstone beneath was anything other than what it looked like. He was moving in good order, correct interval from the man ahead, head up, watching the rooflines the way he'd been trained. He lifted his boot to take the next step. "Stop." The voice in the comms was flat, not urgent, but it cut through everything else because it was the only voice that had spoken in 6 minutes. Wicker stopped. He stood with his weight on one foot, the other boot hovering an inch above the flagstone, and looked down. "Why?" he said. No answer. He waited 5 seconds. He looked at the stone. He looked at the ground beside it. He couldn't see anything wrong. "Why am I stopping?" he asked again. "Don't move from that position." Wicker looked at Marsh. Marsh looked at Vance. Vance put up a fist. The column halted. 12 men standing in a broken street in 4 inches of fresh snow, and nobody moved because a voice had told them not to, and nobody knew why. 40 seconds passed. Then the shot. It came from above and to the left, not from the column's direction, not from the street ahead, but from somewhere elevated, somewhere in the ruins to the northwest. The sound arrived a fraction of a second after the effect. A figure in a third-floor window across the street, a man who had been so still he'd been invisible against the dark interior, dropped sideways without a word. His rifle aimed directly at the position where Wicker had been standing clattered against the window frame. The flagstone, they would discover later, concealed a pressure trigger. The trigger connected to a charge positioned in the drainage channel to Wicker's left. The sniper in the window was back up. He had been watching the trigger point, waiting for one of two things: the trigger to activate, or the column to stop and start probing, at which point he would have opened fire into the clustered unit. Viper 9 had shot him at approximately 340 meters, through a window aperture of less than 16 inches, in falling snow, through a suppressor. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Wicker lowered his boot very slowly onto safe ground. "She saw him?" Holloway said. Not mocking. Now. Something else. "From where?" someone else asked. "She's not on any roofline I can see." "Then she's on one you can't see." The comms clicked. "They already see you," the voice said. 3 more positions. Upper floors, 12 o'clock and flanking. Don't bunch. Keep interval. Vance, Viper 9, confirmation on that? How many total contacts? A pause. Brief, but there. More than your current count. Vance absorbed that without expression. "Move," he said to the column, and they moved. The name had been said once, in the comms check, but now it moved differently. Now it had weight. Viper 9. Holloway didn't say anything else for the next hour. They came from the eastern side streets first. 3 teams, moving in overlapping arcs, not a frontal assault, nothing that simplified into a single engagement. The contact pattern was designed for a unit moving in column, designed to catch them between fields of fire, designed by someone who'd studied how trained infantry instinctively compressed when pressure came from multiple directions. It nearly worked. The first team appeared at the far end of the boulevard, 4 men, good kit, military grade, and opened fire at 200 meters. The column broke left into a partial building, which was the natural move, which was also where the second team was positioned in the interior, waiting in the dark for exactly that. Contact left, interior move back. They moved back into the street. Third team, rooftop, north side. For 8 seconds, which is a long time when rounds are in the air, Bravo platoon was in the worst position a unit can be in, enfiladed, without cover, without a clear axis of retreat. Then the comms. Boulevard team, rightmost shooter neutralized. Rooftop, 2 contacts neutralized. Interior left, the point man is at the window frame. Do not fire into the building. He's moving toward the exit. Let him come out. The shots had come from somewhere nobody had seen. One after another, not sequential in the way a single shooter works, a target line staggered, with the spacing of someone who had pre-calculated positions and was already rotated to the next, before the previous dropped. The man from the interior came out the ground floor exit. He'd abandoned his weapon. His hands were up. Holloway processed all of it in real time with the particular look of someone whose framework for what's possible was being quietly demolished around him. "She took 4 shots in, 12 seconds?" he said. "7, Sergeant First Class Alan Pruitt said. He'd been keeping count. He was that kind of soldier, the one who recorded things not for documentation but because precision was a form of respect for what actually happened, distinct from the story that would be told about it later. 7 shots, 7 seconds, Holloway said again. Slower this time. He was doing the calculation that everyone who heard it eventually did. The time between shots implied not just speed but pre-positioning, pre-calculation, a map of the engagement that existed in her head before the first trigger was pulled. She hadn't been reacting. She had been executing a sequence she'd already written. "Where is she?" Wicker asked, scanning the rooflines. Nobody answered because nobody knew. The ruins above them offered 30 possible positions and she was in none of the ones they were looking at. That was also information, if they'd known how to read it. "The ones you couldn't see are the ones that matter," the comm said. "Move to the parking structure on your 9. 3-story entry, not the ground floor. The ground floor has been compromised." "How do you know the ground floor is compromised?" Vance asked. "Because I've been watching it since we entered." They moved to the parking structure. 3rd floor entry, as instructed. Marsh, bringing up the rear of the column, paused for a moment at the base of the ramp and looked up at the ruins above the city's roofline. The broken silhouettes of towers and facades against a white sky, snow still coming down, nothing visible, nothing moving. She was up there somewhere. He couldn't find her. That, he decided, was the point. She had chosen the building 3 minutes before the column entered the city. From the transport's final approach, she'd had 11 seconds of sightline to the eastern skyline, and in those 11 seconds, she'd made the assessment that most Overwatch personnel would have required a 20-minute grid analysis to produce. Southeastern exposure, clear arcs to the primary avenue, and 3 secondary streets. Partial concealment from the collapsed upper floor of the adjacent tower, elevation sufficient for angles the opposition wouldn't account for. She'd been in position when the column stepped off. She'd already identified 9 contacts before the unit passed the eastern gate. The thermal layer of her optics showed heat signatures through thin walls, not through concrete, not through stone, but through the degraded insulation of buildings that had been empty for 3 years. Human bodies in cold interiors produced readable signatures within a predictable variance range. She'd been tracking them the way a weather system tracks, not as individual decisions but as patterns. The sniper covering Wicker's approach had been the most dangerous of the initial contacts. He'd had a clear shot. He'd been patient. He'd been waiting for one of the column's natural pauses, a radio check, a map consult, a moment when the unit clustered and he would have taken the shot and been gone before anyone found the firing line. She'd taken him at 340 meters because 340 meters was the distance, not because it was a comfortable shot. She did not work from comfort. She worked from necessity and precision, and those were different values than comfort. After the initial engagement, she had moved. Movement was not optional. Suppressor or not, anyone with counter-sniper training would vector from the sound and the angle of fall. She'd gone 3 floors higher, which meant climbing through the interior of a structure that had lost approximately 40% of its floor integrity in the collapse. She'd done it without lights, with her rifle slung across her back and one hand on the rubble for stability, mapping the floor's load path from feel. Cold helped with this. Cold made the structure less variable. Frozen debris didn't shift the same way that warm, damp material did. The creak of stressed wood was quieter, more predictable. She moved slowly, not from caution about the climb itself, but from caution about the sound the climb produced. Sound in a dead city traveled in unintuitive ways. A boot placed wrong could be heard 3 buildings over if the acoustic channel aligned. She had learned this in a different city, a different winter, under conditions she did not revisit unnecessarily. The second position was in a room that had once been an office. The desk was still there. The chair had fallen. A calendar from 3 years ago was still pinned to the wall near the window. She hadn't looked at it. She'd gone straight to the window's right side, set her position, and resumed tracking. The counter hunt had begun. They sent teams in 3-man cells, which was doctrine for a unit that suspected precision engagement. 3-man cells created multiple simultaneous reference points. Any 2 of them could bracket a position from the acoustics of a single shot. She saw them moving into position before the column had reached the boulevard. which meant they'd been pre-positioned, which meant there was command structure coordinating this, which meant this wasn't improvised. More complex than the briefing indicated, she thought, and then she stopped thinking in full sentences and switched to the shorter cognition of active work. Distance, angle, wind, nominal, breath, trigger. The contacts dropped in sequence, not dramatically, simply, the way things work when the math is correct. In the comms, she heard someone say, "She's not human." She didn't respond to that. It wasn't useful information. What was useful? The opposition's command element had realized, approximately 6 minutes into her engagement, that they were dealing with something outside their contingency planning. She could tell from the change in their radio pattern she could not hear their comms, but she could read the behavioral shift of units receiving updated orders. They stopped advancing. They consolidated, and then they started looking for her. They came in pairs. That was the first difference she noticed. The cell structure had changed. 3-man cells needed a base of fire, which anchored them and made them predictable. 2-man teams were faster, quieter, and harder to locate through thermal because they spread the heat signature laterally rather than clustering. 6 of them. 3 pairs, working a search pattern that suggested someone had training in counter-sniper operations. They were moving through the buildings parallel to her line, which meant they'd made a reasonable estimate of her sector. She counted them, then counted the column's remaining engagement, then made the calculation she always made, cost and time. She had 8 minutes before the column reached the next major junction. At the junction, the avenue opened into what had been a market square wide, exposed, no natural cover. If the column reached the square without the opposition's counter-sniper teams being resolved, she would lose her ability to cover them. The square was 400 meters wide. She couldn't cover all of it. She needed to resolve 6 contacts in 8 minutes. The snow had thickened in the last hour. Visibility at distance had compressed from her initial working range of 400 meters to something closer to 280. This changed the problem. At 280, she was working within ranges that counter-snipers also considered practical. The margin narrowed. She moved again. 1 floor down, 1 sector west, putting the wind at her right flank rather than in her face, which changed her acoustic signature from anyone listening to the north. The pair nearest her had gone into a building directly across from her last position. They were professionals. No flashlights, no audible communication, moving with the patience that came from knowing their target was somewhere close. She found the first pair through the thermal 2 heat signatures, one kneeling at a north-facing window, one standing beside the door frame. The kneeling one was looking in her direction. He hadn't found her yet. He was scanning methodically, which meant he would find her in approximately 40 seconds. She did not wait 40 seconds. The shot went through a gap between 2 collapsed wall sections, an aperture of less than 10 inches at her angle. She'd measured it by eye, adjusted for the closing gap produced by the wind's effect on the round at this range and this temperature. The adjustment was approximately 0.3 milliradians, and she didn't think about it consciously any more than a pianist thinks about individual finger placement. It was stored precision, accumulated over years and 10,000 rounds in cold mornings and targets that never shot back. The second man in that pair moved correctly, professionally, toward the doorframe, and she was already rotating to the third and fourth, who had heard or felt something and were compressing against the north wall of their building. The snow worked in her favor then. It deadened the acoustic reflection from her suppressor. The return echo that a counter-sniper uses to triangulate was muffled, diffused, arriving at their position in a way that made the origin vector ambiguous. She took pair 3. She was moving her scope to pair 4 when the shot came through her position. Not close. Close would have been audible, would have displaced air. This was a round that went through the space she had been in 4 seconds earlier, punching through the drywall to her left and striking the interior wall behind. She was already below the windowsill. One of them is better than the others, she noted. She stayed low, moved laterally along the floor, not crawling, more of a controlled crouch walk, maintaining enough height to clear debris. The 6th pair was somewhere north-northeast. The one who'd taken the shot was in that pair. He was good, he'd waited, held position while his partners moved and drew her attention, and taken his shot based on sound and geometry rather than direct visual acquisition. That was real training. She found the building using the angle of the shot through her original wall. Eastward-facing structure, approximately 190 meters. Upper floor, window aperture on the left side of a double frame. The shooter would be positioned against the right side of the window interior, using the left edge as a partial screen, which meant his exposure was limited to a narrow vertical slice. She waited. The snow fell. Somewhere below, She could hear the comms traffic from the column low, compressed, Vance's voice at even intervals. The shooter shifted. She saw the change, not the man himself, but the adjustment of something at the window edge, the micro change in the light differential that comes when a body repositions. He was going to take another look. He thought she had moved from the room. He was right. He was also about to look in the wrong direction. The shot she took was the hardest of the engagement. Through a gap of 8 inches, 190 meters, against a target whose exposure width was approximately 4 inches, with snow reducing the optical clarity by a factor that required compensation on top of the base calculation. She held 2 additional milliradians of drift for the wind, settled her breath in the pause between exhale and inhale, squeezed. The window frame showed the change. She stayed low for another full minute, watching for the 6th contact. The 6th was the second man from that pair, the spotter. He had no shot on her. He had no remaining partner. In most trained units, that meant he would pull back to report. She watched him go. Then she keyed the comms. Counter-sniper element resolved. Column, advance to the market square. Southeast corner entry, not center. Below, she heard the column begin to move. She let out a slow breath and looked at her hands. Steady. She checked the time, 6 minutes and 40 seconds. She'd had 80 seconds to spare. The column advanced. She covered them from the building above the market square entry, tracking the last known positions of the opposition's main body. They were consolidating. She could read it in the thermal signatures, the way the remaining units had pulled back from their forward positions into the larger structure at the square's northern end. A church, originally. Thick stone walls, multiple exits. A bell tower that provided elevation they hadn't used yet. She didn't like the bell tower. Column halt, she said. There's a secondary position in the tower at your 12 that I don't have a clean angle on. Vance, can you clear it? Not from here. I need to reposition. Time? 4 minutes. We hold. She moved. The repositioning took her down 2 floors, across a gap between buildings that required a 4-foot lateral jump over a space with no visible bottom. She didn't think about the drop, only the landing surface, only the angle of arrival and the noise she could or couldn't afford, and up a fire escape on the far building that groaned but held. The new position gave her the tower. 2 contacts inside, one with a heavy weapon system. She could see the thermal signature of the barrel extending past the tower's stone aperture. If the column had moved into the square before she'd spotted this, the heavy weapon would have raked the entire open ground. She resolved the tower contacts. Then, clear. Advance. The column moved through the square. It was during this transit that she was hit. Not a sniper round, she'd resolved the precision threat. This came from a ground-level contact who had stayed buried in a collapsed shop front to the column's right flank, waiting with the patience of someone who had been positioned there before the column arrived. He'd had no shot on her until she'd moved to the fire escape. From that angle, he'd had 2 seconds. He used them. The round caught her left shoulder not clean through, but a grazing impact that tore the muscle at the deltoid insertion and spun her against the fire escape railing. She caught herself with her right hand, kept the rifle from falling, and stayed low. The pain arrived a full second after the impact, which was normal. She assessed. Range of motion in the left arm, reduced but present. Grip strength present. The rifle was right-handed primary operation. She could continue. She did not key the comms. She adjusted her position to take the weight off the left arm, found her new angle, and picked up the contact who had fired. He was moving, trying to get back into cover, having given away his position with the shot. She didn't let him make it. The column was moving across the square. Vance was in the comms. Viper 9, status. She waited until she had verified the square clear of remaining contacts. She was already composing the next movement in her head. The church, the main structure, the residual force that had pulled back there. Clear, she said. Continue, advance. She said nothing about the shoulder. Below, the column reached the far side of the square. She watched them stack on the church entry. Through the scope, she could see Marsh at the rear, the one who'd watched her go into the ruins without mockery, only attention. She'd noticed that. She stayed in position and covered their entry. The pain in her shoulder was a stable frequency now, not growing. She could work with stable. She had been assigned the number by a training coordinator who said it was random. It wasn't random. There had been a previous Viper unit, a 4-person precision fire team that had operated in environments similar to Kessler Bridge, in conditions that also had no clean after-action reports. Viper 1 through 8 were all gone, not dead in every case, but gone from operational capacity. each for different reasons: injury, withdrawal, administrative status change, that the paperwork covered without explaining. She knew this because she had asked directly, and the coordinator had not been a practiced liar. She had been Viper 9 for 14 months. She had deployed 9 times. She had never worked a full operation with another unit. She always came in as a solo attachment. The designation was deliberately isolated because solo attachments didn't create command dependencies, didn't develop the kind of relationships that made commanders reluctant to put a resource into maximum risk environments. She was a tool with a very specific application. She knew this too. She had made a kind of peace with it that wasn't actually peace but was functional, which was sufficient. Her first deployment had been in a situation similar to this, a city, not abandoned, just emptied by conflict, a unit pinned in a structure with no clear extraction route. She had been the one sent in because the unit's own overwatch had been eliminated in the first hour, and nobody in the relief column had the specific capability the situation required. She'd been 22. She'd entered from the west side and covered the extraction for 4 hours in a building that was on fire on the floors below her. That was where she'd learned what she was actually capable of. Not from training. Training told you what was possible in controlled parameters. The fire had told her something different, that the version of herself that existed under maximum pressure was more functional than the version that showed up to training exercises. Some people dissolved under extremity. She compressed. She became more exactly herself. After that, Viper 9 was not just a designation, it was a description. She had not lost a covered unit since that first deployment. She did not think of this as a record to protect. Records implied the possibility of failure was something to be avoided rather than something to be outworked. She also did not think of it as luck. Luck was what people called the intersection of preparation and opportunity when they didn't want to account for all the variables that went into each. What she had was not luck. It was accumulated knowledge and the willingness to use it at cost to herself. The cost had varied. Kessler Bridge was not the first time she'd been hit in the field. The shoulder today was the 3rd wound of her career. The first had been superficial shrapnel, left forearm, 18 stitches, healed, clean. The second had been more serious, a round through the outer thigh that had cost her 4 months of recovery and a period of genuine uncertainty about whether she would return to operational capacity. She had spent those 4 months doing exactly what the medical staff asked of her, and then slightly more, and then the evaluating board had cleared her, and Viper 9 had resumed. Some people who knew pieces of her history used the word dedicated. She didn't use it herself. Dedication implied you were choosing something over alternatives. She didn't experience it as a choice. She experienced it as the shape of who she was when everything else was stripped away. The city, the cold, the scope, the work. This was the version of herself that was most exactly herself. The shoulder bled slowly under her jacket. The cold was helping or at least numbing the signal enough to maintain focus. She had a field dressing in her left chest pocket, but applying it would require using the left arm, which she wasn't going to do until the operation was resolved. The church interior was being cleared by the column now. She could track the movement through thermal, the tight 2-man clearing pattern, the systematic room-by-room approach, Vance coordinating from the center with the precise economy of an experienced commander. Through the scope, she watched the bell tower door from the exterior. If anyone survived the interior push and tried to exit through the tower access and out the tower's ground-level door, she would see them. The comms had been quiet for 4 minutes. Then Vance, structure clear. We're securing the command element. Viper 9, status. She looked at the city around her, the snow still falling, the light changing as afternoon moved toward the flat gray that preceded winter dark. Clear. We've found survivors. Delta Company, 6 remaining. They were held in the church basement. She processed this without response. 6 out of 48. The math was brutal in a way that didn't need commenting on. Then, very quietly, through the compression of the comms, something that might have been static but wasn't. I'm still here. The command element wasn't 6 men in a basement. The command element was 1 officer with a communications setup that had been running coordinated operations across the entire city grid, a former military communications specialist who'd repurposed the church's original electrical infrastructure to power a tracking system that mapped the column's movement in real time. The opposition hadn't been improvised. It had been orchestrated. The 42 lost members of Delta Company hadn't disappeared. They were being held in 3 secondary structures, divided to prevent coordinated rescue, guarded by rotating teams that the church's operator could redeploy based on the column's position. Vance sent Marsh the updated grid in 14 seconds. Marsh sent it to Caldwell's comms frequency. She looked at the grid. 3 structures, forming a rough triangle with the church at the apex. The column could take 1, maybe 2, before the 3rd structure's guard element executed whatever protocol they had for when the command stopped responding. That protocol almost certainly ended badly for the prisoners. She worked the geometry. All 3 structures were visible from a single elevated point, the collapsed cathedral spire, damaged but partially standing, approximately 60 meters east of the church. From the spire, the firing lines to all 3 guard positions were present. Not comfortable lines, not any line she'd call clean, but present. She keyed the comms. "I need 12 minutes, she said. "Hold the column at the church. Do not move toward the secondary structures until I call it. Vance, what are you doing?" "Reducing the guard elements before you approach." A pause. "Viper 9, your status, are you hit?" She had been quiet about the shoulder for 40 minutes. "I'm operational," she said. That wasn't a lie. It was a narrower truth. The spire climb was the hardest thing she did that day. Not because of the distance or the technical difficulty in ideal conditions, but because of the shoulder, which was no longer a stable frequency but a sharp, irregular signal that arrived unpredictably when she put weight on the arm. She climbed using her right arm as primary and her left as a brace, moving through the spire's interior staircase, which had partially collapsed inward and required 3 separate transitions through broken stone. She reached the upper platform. The wind at this elevation was the first real wind she'd felt all day. A lateral pressure from the northwest that required calculation and continuous adjustment rather than a single compensation. The platform gave her the city in all its winter detail. The church, the 3 secondary structures, the market square they'd crossed, the eastern gate where the column had entered. She could see the tracks the column had made in the snow. She could see the first vehicle of the arriving relief force, still 2 kilometers out on the access road, delayed by the secondary route that High Command hadn't accounted for in the timeline. She had 8 minutes before the relief arrived. 8 minutes for the opposition in the secondary structures to receive no communication from their command element and decide what that silence meant. She began working. The first structure's guard element, 3 men at 2 positions. She took them in sequence, working left to right with the wind drift compensation factored as a running adjustment. The shots felt different than earlier in the day. Not worse, different. Her body was compensating for the shoulder by slightly over-recruiting on the right side, which pulled her natural alignment a fraction of a degree. She accounted for this. The second structure. 2 men plus a third, who was outside in the street checking the approach direction, which meant he'd noticed the silence from the church. She took the exterior contact first, before he could re-enter and alert the interior guards. Then, the interior pair. The third structure was the longest shot of the day, 420 meters by her range estimation. Aggravated by the intervening buildings that created a compression effect on the wind, the round would pass through 3 separate wind zones of slightly different character before arrival. She had the data from 6 hours of observing this city's airflow patterns. She had a shoulder that was affecting her stability at the rear bag by a calculable margin. She constructed the shot over 70 seconds. Not the aiming, the preparation, the precise establishment of position, the controlled breathing cycle, the calibration of the variables that were adjustable and the ones that weren't. The variables that weren't adjustable. The shoulder, the degraded rear arm support, the distance, the wind zones, the snow-reducing optical clarity at the far end of the range. These went into the calculation as fixed costs. She did not spend time wishing they were different. The variables that were: her position relative to the window aperture, her breath timing, the specific moment in the wind cycle when the lateral pressure dropped to its minimum value. Wind, even in a city, had a rhythm. She had been studying this city's wind for 6 hours. She knew where it came from, where it pooled, where the buildings deflected it, and where they channeled it into compression. The tower gap between the church and the adjacent structure created a brief, predictable lull in the northwest pressure approximately every 40 to 60 seconds. She waited for the lull. The column was ready at the church. She could see them on thermal. She made the shot. At 420 meters through 3 wind zones with a compromised rear arm, in falling snow, under the flat gray light of a winter afternoon, the shot was the most technically demanding she had executed. The third structure's exterior guard fell. She cycled to the secondary positions inside the structure. One more contact, one of the 4 she'd counted, was not visible. Not through the building's insulation, which meant he was positioned against an exterior wall stone, not drywall, in a way that blocked thermal. She made an estimate based on the positions of the other 3. If she were guarding that structure and she knew the other positions were compromised, she would go to the stairwell access. She'd wait there. She'd watch the door. She put the shot through the stairwell window on the building's east face. The comms, column, advance to secondary structures. All three, simultaneous. Go now. She watched them move through the scope. She could not maintain the left arm support any longer. She let it drop and held position with the right arm and her shoulder against the stone, watching the columns approach, watching the structures, watching for any contact she'd missed. 40 seconds. The column reached the first structure. 1 minute. The second. Structure 2, we have Delta personnel, alive, 8 men. 90 seconds. Structure 111 personnel, wounded, requesting medical. 2 minutes. Structure 3 clear, 14 personnel. 11 and 8 and 14. 33 survivors, plus the 6 in the church. 39 of the 48. She lowered the rifle. She sat with her back against the stone of the spire and looked at the sky close now. The kind of cloud ceiling that meant more snow and all night. The wind was dropping. The city below had gone quiet in a different way than when they'd entered it, not the quiet of concealed threat, but the quiet of aftermath. Her left hand, when she moved it, was significantly less responsive than it had been at midday. That was information she would deal with shortly. Viper 9, Vance said on the comms. Report. She was quiet for a moment. Spire, she said, east of the church. They came to her 20 minutes later. Marsh came first. He'd been the one to figure the geometry, to look at the firing angles and work backward to where she had to have been. He climbed the spire the same route she had, saw the marks on the stone where she'd used her right arm, saw where the left arm had been dragged rather than planted. She was sitting against the north wall. Her rifle was beside her, laid along the floor with the same careful placement she'd given it when she set up that morning. Her jacket was open, and she'd applied the field dressing to the shoulder herself at some point recently, by the look of it, which meant she'd done it after the last shot, not before. She looked at him. He looked at her. He didn't say anything right away. He sat across from her against the opposing wall and looked at the city through the open aperture of the spire, while he caught his breath from the climb. How long, he said. About 40 minutes. He nodded. You kept calling it in. I was operational, she said. Same phrase she'd used on comms. Same narrow truth. 39 survivors, he said. I know. 39 out of 48. She looked at him. Not warmly, not coldly, just directly, in the way she did everything. The other 9 were gone before we arrived. The basement of the church. There wasn't anything to be done about that. He knew. The forensics would confirm it. High Command's delay in deploying the relief, the timeline of Delta's approach. The math of it was brutal, and not anyone's fault who was present today. You should have told us about the shoulder, he said. I was managing it. You could have asked for support. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't need support. I needed time and position. She glanced at the wound, which was now properly dressed. I had both. He didn't have an answer to that. Not a good one. The logic of it was correct, even if the protocol wasn't. He'd been in situations where following protocol would have cost more than it saved. Vance arrived with Pruitt and Holloway behind him. Holloway had to turn sideways to fit through the last section of the stairwell. He came in last, and he stood at the back, and he said nothing at all. Vance looked at the dressing, looked at her face, looked at the rifle on the floor. He crouched to be at eye level with her. Good work, he said. She accepted that without comment, which was the right response. The relief column is 20 minutes out, he said. We'll hold here until extraction. There's a medic with the relief. She nodded. Pruitt was looking at the firing position, the indent she'd made in the accumulated grit on the floor, the angle to the window, the distance to the structures below. He was a man who appreciated geometry. He looked at it for a long time. The third structure shot, he said finally. That was 420 meters. 422, she said. The northwest wind adds 2 meters of correction at this end of the range. Pruitt absorbed that. He looked at the wound dressing. He looked at the floor where her left hand had rested. You made that with one working arm. I had the right arm, she said. Holloway, from the back. Jesus. She looked at him. He was a large man in a small space, and the particular quality of his discomfort was not physical. He was a person who had constructed a clear map of the world, and today had shown him that the map was wrong in a specific and important way. That experience, the revision of a confident belief, produced a particular kind of disorientation that didn't have a simple name. Humility was the word people used, but humility implied a settled state. What Holloway was experiencing was more active, an ongoing recalibration. She did not enjoy it. She did not require his discomfort as validation, but she understood it as honest, which made it acceptable. He was a large man, and the space was small, and he looked genuinely uncomfortable, not with the space but with himself. With the distance between this morning and now. "I was wrong," he said. He said it plainly, without qualification, which was the only way to say it that meant anything. "Earlier, what I said, all of it." She looked at him for a moment with the same direct, non-performing gaze she'd given everything else today. "You didn't know," she said. "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed, "but it's a reason." She left him with that. Outside, the snow had begun again, the same falling silence they'd entered this city through. Now softened, now less ominous, the pressure of it changed by the fact that the day's work was done. The relief column's headlights were visible from the spire window, 2 kilometers out, slow and steady on the approach road, carrying everything that came after. Medics, documentation, recovery. Marsh helped her to her feet. She was steady. Not completely, the shoulder had taken enough that her left side was unreliable, but her face held the same quality it had held all day, which was the quality of someone who had decided, long ago, that steadiness was not a state you maintained but a practice you returned to. Vance asked, as they began the climb down. "Who are you really?" She was quiet for 3 steps of the descent. "Just a call sign," she said. It was true in the way that the most important things are true, not completely, not without the accumulated weight of everything behind it, but as a working definition, accurate enough to carry. Lauren Caldwell was a person with a history and a name and a wound that would take 6 weeks to fully heal. Viper 9 was what she became in places like this one. Both were real, only one was useful here. They brought her down from the spire as the light failed. The relief column reached the church as they crossed the market square, the same square she'd covered from the high building, the same flagstones where Wicker had stopped with one boot in the air at her instruction. The medic found her immediately and took over the shoulder with the focused competence of someone who had no time for discussion. Wicker found her at the medical station while the medic was finishing the dressing. He stood at a respectful distance. He was 21 years old and had learned more today about the gap between confidence and competence than in the preceding 8 months combined. He didn't have words that fit the size of what he wanted to say. "Thank you," he said finally. Simple, insufficient, the only one available. She looked at him. "Follow your interval spacing tomorrow," she said. "Every time, not just when you think someone's watching." He nodded. "That's all," she said. He understood that this was actually generosity. The survivors of Delta Company were being brought out of the 3 secondary structures. 33 men and 6 women, filthy, cold, alive. Some of them were being carried. Some walked on their own with the particular quality of people who had been certain they would not walk out. They came past the platoon in a loose group. One of them, a woman with sergeant's insignia, visible under the grime, stopped when she saw the overwatch position above the market square. She looked at the spire. She looked at the angles. She didn't know the person responsible. She couldn't. She just understood, in the way that trained soldiers understand geometry, that something had operated from that position, at distance, in the falling snow, all day. She stood there for a moment. Then she kept walking. Bravo platoon watched it. None of them spoke. The night was coming in from the east, moving over the broken skyline of Kessler Bridge, turning the ruins from gray to black. The snow continued its patient accumulation over everything. Holloway stood at the edge of the column and listened to the city settle into its new quiet. Not the quiet of a trap unsprung, but the quiet of something finished. He would not have words for it. Exactly. Not right away. But later, much later, in a different city, in a briefing where a commander was going through a roster of available assets and named the call sign without context, he would feel his pulse change. Viper 9. Not with fear. Not exactly. But with the precise and indelible knowledge of what that name carried with it. A spire in a winter city. A shot at 422 meters with a compromised arm. 39 people walking out of buildings they'd expected to die in. And the particular silence of a person who needed no one to bear witness, to confirm that the work had been done. And a girl, no, a soldier who had sat against the stone afterward with no expression of pride, no need for witness, carrying what she'd done the way she carried everything else. Quietly, completely, alone.